The first thing she noticed was the way the floorboards trembled when he stepped closer. Not from fear alone, but from the weight of a man who looked carved out of the land itself. A giant cowboy with shoulders broad as barn doors and eyes like weathered iron, standing between her and every road that ever led out of Dustfall Crossing. And as the saloon's breath seemed to hold around them, Lila Boone felt the grit of her barefoot soles against the warped wood, and wondered how a life could narrow down to one moment so completely that even the past went silent. Because he spoke her name like it was already a promise broken and kept at the same time, telling her she would never struggle again if she gave him 5 strong sons, and the words did not sound like a bargain so much as a sentence handed down by the West itself. And she thought of her mother dying with red dust in her lungs, of her father buried without a marker beyond the dry creek, of the winters she survived by chewing boiled. Roots and hope. And she felt something in her chest twist, not disgust and not desire, but the ache of a door closing behind her, while around them men leaned against the bar pretending not to listen, even as every ear in the room strained, because everyone knew the giant. Amos Calder, a man who had buried 3 wives and built an empire of cattle and bone. A man said to be kind in his silences and merciless in his decisions, and Lila saw in his face the truth that he had not come to ask, but to declare. And she hated herself for noticing the softness hidden under the scar at his jaw, for sensing that he was tired in a way only men who carried too many ghosts ever were. And her hands shook as she held the rag she used to wipe tables, thinking how strange it was that such small hands had survived famine and fever, only to be weighed now against the future of sons not yet born. And as he leaned closer, she smelled leather and dust and the faint iron scent of blood long washed away. And he told her he had land that stretched farther than sorrow, a house that needed a woman's breath to wake it, and a name that could shield her from the cruelty of men who had already taken enough from her, and she wanted to spit at his boots and run. But her feet stayed planted because hunger teaches patience and the West teaches endurance, and somewhere behind her a glass shattered and she flinched, remembering the night her brother died over a card game he never wanted to play. And Amos watched that memory cross her face like a shadow of a cloud, and for a flicker of a second his voice softened as he said he would never strike her, never starve her, never abandon his children to the dirt. And she wondered if that was love or simply pride. And she realized with a cold clarity that love in this land often arrived disguised as necessity. And as the saloon's lamps hissed and flickered, she felt the eyes of the town carving her into a story they would tell for years. The barefoot girl who traded her youth for safety, and she hated them for their certainty, because none of them would carry the weight she was being asked to lift. And Amos straightened then, towering, as if giving her space that felt like another kind of trap, and he said she had until sundown to answer, because a man like him did not beg, and a woman like her did not have the luxury of time, and when he turned away the floorboards sighed in relief. But Lila's chest tightened, as if the air had gone thin, and she stared at his back, at the broad promise of it, and felt something dangerous stir. Not hope exactly, but the stubborn instinct to survive at any cost. And she remembered the stories her mother told about women who bent but did not break, who planted themselves like fence posts and let the storms wear themselves out. And she wondered if bearing 5 sons was just another kind of storm, one she could endure if it meant no more nights, listening to her stomach growl like a wild thing. And yet, as the saloon door swung open and daylight spilled in like a warning, she saw the road beyond it and felt the pull of a life she would never live, a life where her body belonged only to herself and her future was not counted in suns and seasons. And as Amos paused at the threshold and glanced back, their eyes met again, and in that silent exchange she saw not a villain but a man, afraid of dying alone, and that frightened her more than cruelty ever could, because it meant the choice before her was not on the barefoot and evil, but between 2 kinds of loss. And as the sun dipped lower, bleeding gold across the dust, Lila realized that whatever answer she gave would carve her fate deep into the bones of the land. And she stood there trembling, barefoot, and seen, knowing the West was watching, waiting to see whether she would step forward into his shadow or turn and face the long, merciless road alone. And the clock on the wall ticked louder with every heartbeat, counting down to a decision that would change everything. Dawn broke hard and unforgiving over Red Willow, the kind of light that exposes every lie a man has ever told himself. And when Gideon Cross stepped onto the porch with his rifle low and steady, he saw 3 riders spread loose across the yard, dust still clinging to their boots, confidence hanging off them like cheap cologne, because men who take without consequence start to believe the world itself belongs to them, and the one in front smiled when he spoke, calling Gideon a fool for thinking. Silver could buy silence, saying the girl inside was property, marked and claimed, and Gideon felt the old violence stir in him, the kind he had buried under years of pretending to be done with blood. But this time, it was different, because behind him, inside the cabin, lay a woman who had already been to the edge of living and decided she would rather fall than kneel again. And Gideon understood with a clarity that burned that destiny does not knock twice. The first shot cracked the morning open, echoing off the mesas like judgment, and when the dust settled, 2 men were down and the third was running, screaming promises that would never reach another sunrise. And Gideon did not chase him, because some lessons spread faster when carried by fear. He stood there shaking, not from the killing, but from what it had unlocked, because for the first time since the night he rode away from his own burning past, he had chosen to stay and face the cost. Inside, Mara had woken to the gunfire, had dragged herself to the doorway despite the pain, and when she saw the bodies in the dirt, she did not cry or recoil. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, like someone finally setting down a weight they've been forced to carry too long. And Gideon realized then that saving someone does not look like the stories say. It looks like standing in the wreckage afterward and deciding what kind of man you're going to be when the smoke clears. The days that followed were slow and brutal in quieter ways, because healing is not a straight road and neither was forgiveness, and Mara did not suddenly trust him just because he had spilled blood on her behalf. She watched him with the same careful distance she watched fire, knowing it could warm or destroy, and Gideon accepted that because he was done demanding belief from anyone, including himself. He took her to a doctor 2 towns over, a woman with tired eyes who asked no questions and stitched what could be stitched, and when Gideon paid her, she told him some wounds don't close. They scar over and ache when the weather changes. And Gideon thought that sounded a lot like a soul. Word spread, as it always does, about Red Willow and the men who never came back, and fewer strangers rode that way after, which suited Gideon fine, because for the first time the silence felt earned. Mara grew stronger in inches, learning the land, learning the horses, learning that not every touch came with a price, and some nights she still woke screaming, trapped in memories that didn't care about fences or sunrise, and Gideon would sit outside the door until the sound stopped, not crossing lines she hadn't invited him to cross, because love, he learned too late, is mostly restraint. When winter came early and hard, they faced it together without ever naming what they were becoming, because naming things makes them fragile, and both of them had survived by being unbreakable. The brand on her hip healed into a scar, ugly and permanent, and one night by the fire she told him she would never be able to forget what had been done to her. And Gideon told her he didn't want her to, because forgetting is how men like those riders keep walking free. And she looked at him then with something like understanding, like 2 broken pieces recognizing the same fracture. In the spring, Mara told him she was leaving, not because she was running, but because staying out of gratitude is just another kind of cage. And Gideon nodded even though it felt like tearing muscle from bone, because if there was one thing destiny had taught him, it was that you do not get to own the people you save. On the morning she rode out, she stopped at the gate and said he had not finished her the way she had asked that first night, but he had finished something else, something that needed killing long before she ever arrived, and she rode away with her head high, carrying scars but no chains. And Gideon watched until the dust swallowed her shape, knowing some stories are not meant to end with 2 people standing side by side, but with both of them standing upright on their own. Years later, folks would tell a story about Red Willow, about a rancher who chose mercy and paid for it in blood and solitude, and about a woman who walked out of hell and never let it follow her. And if this story stirred something in you, if you believe the West was shaped not just by guns, but by the choices men made when no one was watching, then remember to subscribe to Western Destiny Tales, because these are not just stories of the past, they are echoes of who we choose to be when destiny looks us in the eye and waits for an answer.